Welcome back, everybody. Give you kind of a minute to get situated here as we come back from our break. So I'm not sure why this should say lesson 3, but so what we want to talk about in this lesson is sort of how to broadly apply marginal analysis for environmental decision making, and in particular, thinking about what this looks like in the context of kind of policy and social choice. So how do we make these decisions when they affect a large group of people and we're not just thinking about individual decision making? So the key questions we want to consider are, who are the key players in developing environmental policy decisions? Who's at the table, right? What input do we get into this? And then how do these different players that are at the table make these decisions? What are their basis or criteria for making decisions or for advocating particular positions? And then how does that all translate into the policy that we actually have? And so what I want to do is talk about that kind of in a general way, and then go through a bunch of specific examples. And then we'll spend the last probably 20 minutes or so giving you all a chance to get into breakout groups and think about sort of ranking environmental priorities. So the key players I want to think about are scientists, economists, policymakers, which we're actually going to talk about last, and then interest groups. And these are the folks that really have a role in shaping and influencing environmental policy in particular, but public policy in general. And so again, we want to think about kind of the interests and incentives and perspectives of each one of these groups and how that's potentially going to influence policy. So to start off with, if we think about scientists and what scientists are focused on and what their objectives are and what their basis for decision making is the role of science in helping inform public policy is really to accumulate scientific factual evidence over time. So a lot of the time, externalities or our understanding of the severity of an externality, whether it's something we should even care or worry about, really comes down to understanding science, right? There's some scientific relationship that we need to understand, whether that's, if I burn a lump of coal, it's going to put CO2 into the atmosphere. And then that has all of these different implications, right? And those are fundamentally scientific questions. What is the impact of particulate matter on human health? What is the impact of CO2 emissions on, global warming and climate change? And then how does that impact things that we care about? Those are scientific questions. So on the left here, we have folks out doing field work, doing stream quality monitoring, figuring out the amount of pollution that's in this particular stream. On the right here is a famous scientific breakthrough. That's a picture of John Snow. And this is this map he built. So John Snow is basically the person that figured out that cholera was driven by water quality and basically sewage in drinking water. Prior to John Snow, they thought it was something called miasma, which is just like clouds of toxic air. And we really didn't understand where cholera was coming from. And he basically did this experiment where he realized there were these outbreaks of cholera in London, and he realized that people that were drinking from certain pumps where you could go and pump water and take it back home were the ones that were getting sick, and nobody else was getting sick. And then basically figured out that a couple of pumps had been contaminated by sewage. So that's an example of how science can really help us inform sort of our understanding of the basic economic problem and environmental problem we're trying to face, because previous to that breakthrough, we thought it was just like clouds of toxic air, and you might have a very different approach to thinking about that externality than to realizing, oh yeah, we probably don't want to be dumping sewage into the waterworks just upstream of like a pump where people are taking out drinking water. And so science is really important. However, science doesn't get us all the way there. Science can tell us about kind of the physical impacts and physical relationships. But then economics is going to really come into play. And so the role of economics in thinking about public decision making is to take in that scientific factual evidence and then think about the marginal benefits and marginal costs of different types of actions. And so economics might actually lead us to have a very different perspective than just the pure science. And this is particularly true when it comes to environmental problems. I like to contrast the perspective of engineers versus economists. So on the left there is a picture of Roosevelt Dam in Arizona, which makes Lake Roosevelt. This was one of the first major dams built by the federal government in the early 20th century to basically provide some flood control and then storage for water that could be used for irrigation in the summer. So the Bureau of Reclamation is this federal agency that goes around and builds dams specifically for water storage purposes. There's another agency called the Army Corps of Engineers that builds dams for flood control purposes. And it turns out there's like a lot of places around the West where you could build a dam like this that has like the right physical engineering characteristics where you could basically you have a river that's going through a canyon with an upstream area that would create a really nice reservoir. And so famously in the 1970s, there was kind of a series of dams that were proposed to be built by the Army Corps of Engineers under well, one of the plans was called the Pick-Sloan plan, but basically where engineers had run around and just figured out, like from a scientific perspective, like where should we build dams? Where could we back up a lot of water by putting in a relatively small amount of concrete, which is like a fun problem for an engineer to solve. But that completely ignores the economics of the issue, which is what are the costs and benefits of putting in a dam like this? You're going to take what was a bunch of land and turn it into a reservoir. That's going to have a bunch of benefits. There's going to be, there's a lot of recreation that happens on these reservoirs. There's water security and storage benefits, but you're also going to flood a bunch of land and potentially displace a bunch of people, right? And so one of the places that economics has famously played a really big role in public policy was during the Carter administration in the 1970s. Economists came in and did what's called cost benefit analysis to basically think about like, okay, what are the costs and benefits of building this dam? Should we actually do it? Which is a very different way of looking at the problem than just like from an engineering perspective, is this a good place to build a dam or not? A similar sort of issue arises when it comes to electric vehicles. So I've got a picture of an EV there in the middle. So again, like an engineering perspective might tell you like, okay, the problem I am trying to solve is how can we drive around without putting carbon into the air when, basically without an internal combustion engine. That's a very well-defined, relatively narrow engineering problem to solve. And we have lots of really cool, fancy looking EVs on the road. They've come a long way in the last decade. There's some pretty nice EVs out there now that by all accounts are actually a lot more fun to drive than internal combustion engines. But that's like the engineering solution that might miss some really important aspects of the broader question of reducing carbon emissions from automobiles. So it turns out the sort of climate change and carbon benefits of driving an EV really, 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 really depend on where you live. Because when you plug in that EV, you're pulling power from the grid, right? So if you live in a place where your electricity is generated by a coal-fired power plant, you may not be creating any benefit for the climate by driving an EV. And in fact, you could make things worse depending on what car you're replacing with your EV. Whereas if you live in a place with a relatively clean grid that's using a lot of hydropower or renewable energy, then there's going to be a lot of climate benefit associated with having an electric vehicle. And we'll talk about those kind of joint investments a little bit more when we talk about climate change. But the point is, economists are going to tend to take kind of a broader perspective on these things. And again, think about the opportunity costs of different types of resources. Think about the unintended consequences of doing things. And so it's really important to have economics in public policy because there's a tendency of engineers to just focus on the physical problem and solving the physical problem without thinking about the potential trade-offs that come along with it. And so then that's kind of to illustrate the point on the far right picture there. It's just an issue of the economists thinking about like, okay, we need clear thinking on climate change. We really need to take an economic perspective to this, and that's what we'll do in our last lecture. Another sort of important player at the table are interest groups, and interest groups tend to have, they're going to bring in evidence to the discussion, but it's going to be really tailored to a particular issue that they care a lot about. And this can get really interesting and create some interesting tensions in the context of environmental policy that you may not expect. So, one of the things that's really critical for sort of like combating climate change, right, is developing a lot of renewable energy production. Turns out renewable energy production takes a lot of land compared to drilling oil and gas and burning coal and things like this. It just takes up a lot of land to put up solar panels and wind farms on a per megawatt basis. You're just going to use up a lot more land. And so there's real concern about the habitat impact. So this is a picture of a solar farm in the Mojave Desert. There's for some of us, you might look at the Mojave Desert and say, like, yeah, that's a great place to put up a bunch of solar panels. But it turns out it's habitat for things like the desert tortoise. And so there are interest groups. There are some interest groups out there lobbying for subsidies and policies to put in more renewable energy. Then there are other interest groups that are less worried about that and really, really care about the desert tortoise. And they are super opposed to putting in more solar in the Mojave Desert, for instance. And so they're going to bring in evidence. So the climate folks are going to talk a lot about climate change and impacts and the benefits of solar. The desert tortoise folks are going to come in with evidence talking about all of the ways in which, plowing up untrammeled desert and putting in solar panels is going to destroy habitat for the turtle. And so you're going to get evidence mediated by the particular goals that different groups have. And of course, the thorny job of policymakers is to bring all of that together and sort of think about the politics of making a particular decision. And the key point that I want to make here is that the political considerations or the incentives facing a politician or a bureaucrat might be very different than the criterion we were talking about in the first lecture of sort of maximizing net benefits to society. And so, depending on how electoral incentives work, who somebody's constituency is, they may or may not be concerned about like the overall net benefit to society. A given politician, their incentive is to get reelected, and so their incentive is going to be responsive to the incentive or to the interests of their particular constituency. And so one really famous example of this is nuclear power. So from the perspective of a lot of folks, nuclear power is like the answer to climate change because it's a near zero emission technology and it works very well. However, like there's lots of risks associated with it that I don't really want to get into the debates about the scale of those risks or like how serious they are. But in general, it's true that people don't want to live near a nuclear power plant. So you may think from a very aggregate social perspective, like, yeah, this is obvious. Like, let's just build a bunch of nuclear reactors and we can solve this overnight. But the problem is you got to figure out where to put it. And no congressman is going to vote to put one of these things in their district because we have what's called the not in my backyard phenomenon or NIMBYism, which is that people don't want these things next to them. And so even though in the aggregate, it might be the thing that maximizes benefits to society, if you think about the individuals and their private benefits and private costs, nobody necessarily wants to live next to a nuclear power plant. And so politics is going to translate those costs and benefits into a policy decision that may or may not reflect the aggregate costs and benefits. It may reflect the distribution of costs and benefits of the particular policymakers, that have a seat at the table. And so the problem is, how are we going to get agreement or at least alignment from different groups related to a specific policy? And how should we weigh the costs and benefits across different people and groups? And so what I want to do is just go through like a few examples of thinking through expected marginal benefit versus expected marginal cost, starting with some kind of like trivial examples that might be fun for students that have more to do with private benefits and costs, and then moving into some examples that have public benefits and costs, external benefits and costs that maybe accrue to different groups of people, and kind of think about, well, what policy do we actually have? Like, what does policy currently tell us about how we make decisions on those things? So really simple example, right, that some of your students might grapple with. Should I get a full-time job after high school, or should I go to college and either not work or work part-time? You can kind of talk with your students and think through the costs and benefits of that, right? If I get a full-time job after high school, what's the opportunity cost? If I go to college, what's the cost of going to college? It's not just the cost of my tuition, it's the opportunity cost of the foregone wages. Whereas if I get a full-time job, if I think about my earning potential 5-10 years down the road, it might be lower for having not gone to college, et cetera. So you can sort of help them think through these costs and benefits, right? Once you're in the labor force, something that all of us probably confront, right, is thinking about the costs and benefits of staying in our current job versus pursuing a new job or a new career. Again, mostly a private decision. You can kind of talk through that with your students. What would make you potentially want to leave your job? What are the benefits of doing that? What are the costs of doing that, et cetera? And then we can start to get into some decisions that seem like private decisions, but might have some external components, right? So one thing that we all probably confront, particularly if you live near a metro area, and in fact, we were talking about this with housing costs, right? You think about living in a nicer apartment or a cheaper house, having more land, for instance, living outside of the city in a rural area versus living very close to where you work or living in the downtown core, which has other amenities, but you're not going to be able to afford as nice of a place, right? And so you're trading off kind of the quality and the cost of your place of where you live versus having to commute and spend time in traffic. And so lots of individuals are making that choice privately, right? When they choose whether to live downtown or choose whether to live out in the suburbs. And they're thinking about the benefits of having a nicer place in the suburbs versus the cost of having to commute into traffic. But critically, when they make that decision, they're thinking about the private cost to them of sitting in traffic, and they're not thinking about the fact necessarily that by choosing to commute, they're contributing to traffic, and so they're actually making everybody else's commute worse as well, right? And so that was John's example of the freeway being a tragedy of the commons, because people are just going to keep entering as long as there's some kind of positive benefit. They're going to use up all of the sort of spare capacity on the freeway. And so that's one where, okay, we can start to think about, well, what are some policies that could shift this one way or the other? Zoning is one of them, changing the costs of building downtown versus other places. The government might think about widening freeways or adding more freeways. That's not going to really change the externality problem. It might change traffic in the short run, but in the long run, you'll actually just end up with more freeways that are crowded. But one thing that's become popular recently, right, is congestion pricing, or the idea that you could pay to use like an express lane during crowded times of the day, and that might give people some different incentives about driving versus other forms of commuting. To get into another social question, what do we think the efficient amount of pollution is? Or let me put this differently. Is the efficient amount of pollution zero? No, I've got lots of people waving their head no. Why isn't the efficient amount of pollution zero? Any thoughts?
You're going to be giving up too much.
You're going to be giving up too much. What would it take to have zero pollution, right? We would have to shut down all economic activity. Even if we were just thinking about air pollution, forget about water pollution, noise pollution, these other things. We just wanted to have zero carbon emissions tomorrow. You know, anybody with an internal combustion engine wouldn't be allowed to drive. A lot of places wouldn't have power. And so, yeah, as we think about reducing emissions more and more, it becomes increasingly costly to do that. And so we have to think as a society, well, what is the amount of pollution that maximizes net benefits? Well, it's going to be where the external marginal benefit is equal to the external marginal cost. And we have to really think about what that looks like. And again, that might be different in different cities, where the nature of the air pollution externalities is really different. So to give an example of that, I was talking about how where you live sort of determines the net impact of EVs. The other sort of piece of that is how bad is the local air pollution externality. So there was a great paper by an economist named Stephen Holland a few years ago where they asked this question, and basically they said, where does it make sense to subsidize EVs? Where do we want to see more EVs? And the two things that matter are the thing I already mentioned, which is how dirty is your grid. But the other thing that matters is how bad is the local air pollution externality. And so it turns out in a place like Los Angeles, EVs make a lot of sense because the physics of the basin are such, like we all know, LA tends to have a smog problem, right? So there's a lot of issues that come from congestion and automobile use of internal combustion engines in LA. There's a huge benefit of turning a regular car into an EV in terms of that side of it. And then on the other side, most of LA's power is coming from somewhere pretty far away, and most of it is coming from relatively clean sources. And so you're taking a dirty source that's creating local air pollution and then translating it into an EV. In contrast, in a place like Atlanta, the local air pollution externality associated with people sitting in traffic isn't as bad. It's not as big of a city, and just the physics of the local climate, those emissions don't tend to get trapped as much. And it turns out that relative to a place like LA, a lot of the electricity that's generated for residents of Atlanta is generated by older power plants that burn pretty dirty coal, and they're not that far from the city, again, relative to LA. And so if you think about translating, what is the efficient amount of, say, driving of air pollution that way, the question has a very different answer depending on where you live and sort of the economics of what it looks like to generate electricity in that place. To consider another example, we could think about something like endangered species habitat versus I'll call it agricultural land use or ranching. And this is one that I think is a really nice example for students for illustrating that the benefits and costs of different types of environmental protection and different types of policy might accrue to very different people. So we have the Endangered Species Act and a whole set of policies for putting something like a grizzly bear on the endangered species list. And then once something's on the endangered species list, the main way we sort of try to protect it, or the main thing the Endangered Species Act does, is it restricts land use to protect habitat. So that's, we're going to go draw maps and say, okay, where's critical habitat? Like, obviously you can't go kill a grizzly bear. That's the first thing, right? It's on the endangered species list. Can't intentionally kill it. But then there end up being a bunch of restrictions on land use to create and preserve places for grizzly bears or other endangered species to live. And so the main kind of mechanism for a species like the grizzly bear is going to be restrictions on land use. The rationale for doing that, for protecting an endangered species, is that there's what's called existence value to those species. A lot of us might care about grizzly bears, even though we'll never see one. I spend a lot of time backcountry fishing in this part of the world. I hope to not run into one, right? I actually don't want to see a grizzly bear up close and personal, but we may get some utility, some benefit from knowing that these things exist in the wild. It's kind of an iconic species, right? Same is true of wolves, same is true of like condors, bald eagles, whatever it is. There's a large and wide swath of the population that might get some benefit from knowing that we've preserved these species. They also tend to, play important roles in the broader ecosystem, right? So it's a really dispersed benefit across all of society. And often thinking about that environmental Kuznets curve idea, the sort of shorthand that people use for this is like the Connecticut housewives really care about wolves in Yellowstone, for instance. And the idea is just that like you have, people with relatively strong preferences for the environment that might actually live very far away from the place where the species lives, but they care very deeply about protecting that species. So that's the benefit side. Who bears the cost of protecting grizzly bears? Well, it's the people who would be using this land to do something else. And so the cost of species protection tend to be very, very localized, and those costs tend to be borne by a much smaller subset of the population than the people that actually benefit from protecting that species. And so having more grizzly bears running around in, say, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, or having more wolves running around in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, is going to create a lot of conflicts with, say, ranching, for instance. So it may or may not generate direct restrictions on what ranchers can do with their land, but it's definitely going to lead to more cattle depredation, like bears and wolves eat cows. And so there's a lot of costs that are borne for protecting those species, but they're borne by very different people. And so that's just I think a really nice example to illustrate that the really high level question of, okay, is it net beneficial to society as a whole to, say, protect grizzly bears or wolves, might be a very different question or have a very different answer than, well, who bears the benefits and costs? And in settings where the people that bear the costs also receive the benefits of a policy, it's relatively more straightforward to get that policy enacted, right? Because the same people are sort of at the table. But when we have settings like this where very different people are bearing the benefits and costs, it can be really controversial. And of course, sort of the nature of the US federal system sort of maps into that as well, right? Where in a federalist system, you might have something like a Federal Endangered Species Act, so this nationwide policy that's affecting local land use. States might feel very differently about it, so there's actually a lot of controversy between sort of the governments of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming and the federal government about how species like wolves and grizzly bears are managed. Another example that's sort of more close to my expertise in research would be thinking about, okay, well, what's the best use of a scarce resource? What are the rules for determining that? How do we craft that policy? And so we'll think about water for a moment. I've used the example of water a little bit already. So much of the West, I showed you that map of the Colorado River Basin earlier. You might ask the question, well, like, how do we decide who gets to use how much of the Colorado River? And the Colorado River is a really interesting example because it turns out we have something called the Colorado River Compact that basically divides up the river among all of the states that all of the what's called the basin states that the Colorado River flows through, and you can see them in the pie chart over here. It actually starts up in Wyoming as the Green River, flows down into Colorado and Utah, so they get an allocation, flows along the border of Arizona and Nevada, so they both get an allocation. New Mexico actually gets a small allocation because some of the headwaters of streams that end up in the river are in New Mexico. And then California has a very large allocation. It forms the border of California and Arizona. And then Mexico, the country of Mexico, also has an allocation. It turns out that when the Colorado River Compact was signed in 1912, 1923, something like this, the river was at a historically high flow and had been for a number of years. And so the amount of water that is legally apportioned to all of these different states under the Colorado River Compact exceeds what we've actually had in the river on an annual basis for the last couple of decades. And so we have this fundamental problem of the river is more scarce than what we've legally allocated. And we've made up the difference with water that's been stored in the reservoirs, but those reservoirs are running dry. And so there's all sorts of questions going on about both between states. Can we revisit that allocation? Is it really fair for California to get 4.4 million acre feet or a quarter of the river where Arizona only gets 2.4 million acre feet, et cetera? How do we allocate water between states? And then within states, how much of that water, again, should go to cities? How much of it should go to agriculture? It turns out that it's really difficult to move that water around. And so a lot of it is in pretty low valued agricultural use and would be much higher valued in cities, but there's lots of institutions that get in the way from moving it from sort of agricultural uses to urban uses. And so you need changes in policy to bring about that change in the allocation. And so, but one thing that is really interesting about this to me is that, yeah, about 80% of water that we use in the Western United States is still used in agriculture. And a lot of that water is worth about 1/10 in agriculture what it would be worth to, say, a city. And so the real problem of Western water is less about finding more water and more about reallocating water from low valued uses to high valued uses. So that's just another example of, again, thinking about it at the margin, where should that marginal unit of water go? Where is it going to be valued the most highly? So that's just a few examples that could be fun to kind of work through with your students. Okay, so what I want to
Brian, before you move on, someone did
Yeah.
have a question about who decides what percentage of the water goes where.
Yeah,
That's
so
interesting.
this graph, I should change this. This graph is misleading. So the Colorado River Compact is an agreement between all of these states that is sort of overseen by the federal government. So the United States Bureau of Reclamation manages the dams, so Lake Mead and Lake Powell, that store a bunch of water, and they have contracts with irrigators and cities in each of these states. But there is an agreement between all of these states ratified by the federal government. Mexico is also involved in the agreement that says who gets how much. And it's actually for the lower basin states, which is California, I think Nevada is technically in the lower basin, and Arizona. It's quantified. So California gets 4.4 million acre feet. Arizona gets 2.8 million acre feet. Nevada is really small. It's like 300,000 acre feet. So there's a specific amount of water. So California gets to take that every year, no matter what. It's not a percentage. That amounts to 27%, but they are allocated a right to a certain amount of water. The upper basin states actually do it as kind of a proportional share. So if there's less water in the river in a given year, everybody cuts back equally, but that's not how it's done. So those rules have basically been in place since the 1920s. There's been a few kind of amendments over time, but like changing anything about that requires getting all of these states plus Mexico at the table and forming an agreement. There's been a little bit of movement around that in the last 2 or 3 years. There was like a real crisis and emergency in 2021 and 2022 where the water in Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which are these two giant reservoirs made by Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam. Those dams both generate a lot of electricity. They're hydroelectric dams. So Phoenix gets a lot of power from Glen Canyon Dam. Las Vegas and Los Angeles get a lot of power from Hoover Dam. the water in both of the reservoirs was getting so low that there was fear that it was going to hit what's called dead pool, which is it gets so low that there's still water in the lake, but it's below where it should go into the turbine. And so you can't generate electricity. And so that's a nightmare scenario for anybody living in the Southwest. And so in 2021 and 2022, there were all these emergency actions being taken to get more water into the lake, to get people to use less water. And so there was some renegotiation between California and Arizona. But then we've had 2 really good snow years and the lakes are starting to rise again. And so now everything is kind of back to normal. So all that to say, there's a thing called the Colorado River Compact that basically decides. But whenever there's a drought, there's discussion of amending the compact and doing things a little bit differently. Okay, I better shift gears here so that we have time to do our activity. So want to give you all kind of an opportunity to think through these types of issues, use marginal analysis to think about trade-offs, both in terms of environmental objectives, but also kind of other policy objectives. And so we're going to think about this in the context of some of the UN's sort of sustainable development goals. And this is a great activity for students. We're going to go ahead and have you all do the activity, but it's a great one for students as well. So in a moment here, I'm going to send you into breakout groups for about 10 minutes. And the idea here is that you have $50 billion to spend to try to solve and kind of reduce human suffering as much as possible. And here's 17 policy options. So you're the UN and you're getting to pick which policies you want to prioritize. And you basically, what we're going to try to do here is develop a rank ordering from your most preferred to your least preferred policies. Now, 17 is a lot, especially in 10 minutes. So you're gonna have to go meet with your breakout group, choose a speaker who's going to report back to the rest of us. So if one person per breakout group could kind of record your rank ordering, and then we'll debrief when we're done. But 17 is a lot. And so what I would suggest you do is you identify a top 3 or 4 and a bottom 3 or 4. Start there. What are the top 3 to 5 things? What are the bottom 3 to 5 things? And then you can kind of fill out the middle. And probably what I'll do is I'll just have you tell me your top and your bottom. And that's a good suggestion for how to do this with students as well, because it can be a little overwhelming to try to rank order 17 things in 10 or 15 minutes. If you did this in a classroom setting, you could give them more time. You could let them, Google stuff about the value of these different things. But this is going to be our activity. So in a moment here, Debbie's going to send you into breakout groups. Introduce yourself to your group mates. Please identify a leader or a speaker who's just going to write down your issues or your rank ordering of the top and the bottom. I will leave this slide up shared so that you can see it. I'm trying to think, John and Debbie, do you remember, do they need to take a screenshot of this so they can still see it in the breakout groups?
They do. They won't be able to see it once they go to breakouts.
Yeah, so I would suggest everybody take a quick screenshot of this if you can, so that you can see it in the breakout groups, and then I'll attempt to broadcast it if I'm able, but I think we've had trouble with that in the past. So again, top 3 things, bottom 3 things, and then work on filling out the rest. And your objective here is to sort of get the most bang for your buck, reducing human suffering. So Debbie, if we can go ahead and send them into breakout groups, and we'll send you there for about 10 minutes.
Let's see, for number 1, we had G, which
Okay.
is provide access to basic health care.
Okay.
2, we had F, so providing access to water. And then Q was improving access to education. So I guess kind of the trend that we noticed was trying to improve or give access to these basic needs to people that didn't have it or didn't have good quality. And then our bottom 15, 16, and 17, let's see, it was P. 15 was P, government lowering the cost of starting a business. We didn't see that as necessarily focused on just environmental or social issues. 16 was M, expanding research to sea level rise. And then 17, we had D, which was expanding broadband service globally. And again, kind of whether it was research or providing something that wasn't as targeted to just those issues, we felt like that had to go at the bottom of the list.
Awesome, thank you.
Mhm.
Group 2. Top 3, bottom 3. Anybody from group 2?
I'm not sure we noticed what our group numbers were, to be honest, so
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think actually Debbie can tell us, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So group 2 had Chasey, Cheryl, Heather, Kristen, and Ray.
Okay, I can go ahead and talk for group 2.
Awesome.
Similar to what the last person said, we had F, G, and A as probably our top 3. Again,
Yeah.
with the idea of you need those basic necessities to survive. And towards the bottom, we had M as well. We also had, which ones did we have? We had, sorry, somebody else wrote them down, so I'm trying to remember what we had said. I think it was also K we had towards the bottom, and maybe H. If anybody in my group wants to jump in and say something different, that's okay too.
All right, thank you. Group 3.
All right, so group 3, we just did a top 3 and bottom 3, and then
Sure.
kind of questioned a bunch of them to go in the middle because it seemed like a lot of them were kind of repetitive or could have tied in with something else. But the top 3 were F, potable water, then G, basic healthcare, and then O, infant and child nutrients.
Nice.
And then the bottom 3 is M, pretty much the research to the sea level rise. And then L, green energy initiative. And then C, reduce the green emissions in individual, whatever that last name was.
Great. Group 4. Anybody remember being in group 4? All right. Well, I think
I do
yeah,
remember
go
being
ahead.
in group 4. Sorry, I just wasn't sure if anybody was going to jump in or not. This is what I kind of got here. I hope I got this right. We had number 1 was to provide access to basic healthcare, and our second one was to expand broadband service globally, and 3, provide some funding for agricultural research. And I think 4 was expand infant and child nutrition programs. Our bottom ones, we didn't get too far with the bottom ones because we had a lot of discussion on those top ones. I think we had providing microloans for developing nations as a low priority. Developing trade liberalization procedures, mainly because we wasn't quite sure what all that meant. And then I wasn't sure about 15 micronutrients in developing nations. We put that low as well.
Awesome, thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip groups 5 and 6. I apologize. I want to get to what the Copenhagen Consensus actually said about these things. So this was getting together some of the top economists in the world to basically do a cost benefit analysis on every single one of these 17 things and then rank them according to which has the biggest bang for its buck. And this is a little bit dated. John actually put something in the chat with some more recent work from the Copenhagen Consensus if you're interested in sort of seeing an updated version. But kind of where you all are at, which is focused on some of the healthcare related things, is right in line with what the Copenhagen Consensus found. So it's really about meeting those basic needs and dealing with healthcare issues where you get the greatest bang for your buck. And in fact, you'd spend all 50 billion on just those top 4 things. And then some of the investments with lower kind of cost benefit or benefit cost ratios, lower bang for your buck are going to be these things lower down at the bottom, having to do with the environment, having to do with climate change. One thing I will say about that John and I were chatting about while you all were in the breakout rooms is this is from 2004. We've learned a lot about the social cost of carbon and the cost of climate change, and frankly, like rethought the benefits of some of these other things since 2004. So I think the rank ordering could maybe look a little bit different today. And then the other point from the debriefing that I wanted to raise is that this is kind of a global priority ranking. And you might imagine that this list could look very different for different countries, depending on the extent to which they have a problem with HIV and AIDS. Maybe coastal nations feel a little bit differently about investing in sea level rise, right, than the rest of us. Things like this. So it could be very different for different countries, but this is a great activity to run with students to get them thinking about trade-offs, right? Because these are all, like, I don't think there's a single thing on the list that we would say, like, you know, we wouldn't want to have the benefits associated with that. The problem is it's costly to pursue those things, right? And so we have to think about trade-offs and how do we allocate our resources most effectively. So I had already eaten into your lunch by 1 minute, so I want to leave it there and stop. We'll have a 30-minute break for lunch, so we'll come back at I guess, what is it on? Well, I guess West Coast time, it'll be 11:51 or 52, and then John's gonna run another like pretty involved activity with all of you that really brings a lot of these different concepts together, and then we'll conclude with a lecture on climate change. So 30 minutes for lunch. We'll see y'all back here in about 30 minutes.